Good evening. My name is Laura Handler, and together with co-editors Tina Hefner, if you want to wave, if everybody's still got their video on, and Tracy Rock, colleagues from the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. We thank you for your time and interest to engage with us as we use the research and ideas from our book, The Divide Within, to springboard discussion into possible intersections and proposed solutions to many of the issues facing social scientists, educators, and global citizens of the world. We look forward to hearing your contribution throughout our session tonight. As a little bit of background, this conference, this work is a culmination of ideas that were investigated, discussed, and presented at the Social Science Education Consortium, SSEC, conference that was held in Charlotte in North Carolina in July 2019. When we began our conference planning, we were still contemplating the aftermath of the 2016 and 2018 elections and the deep divides, polarization, and identity politics that had gripped our nation. As we are well aware from a multitude of events over the past year, and particularly January 6th, most of these troubling chasms remain and present challenges to a new administration, local leaders, and educators alike. Beyond divisions in American politics, race, ethnicity, religion, geographic locations, ideologies, we felt the divisions in education, from the intellectual spaces shaping our worldviews to the media and publications influencing interpretations of events, and even to the universities, schools, and classrooms where dialogue was and continues to be often stifled or avoided altogether. So we wondered, where are the shared spaces where we can bring these divisions together through our dialogue, research, and scholarship? We had several guiding questions that we proposed to social scientists across disciplines, across geography, history, civics, psychology, sociology, economics. We asked, one, in a polarized political climate characterized by skepticism, hostility, and claims of fake news, what common ground can be found in the social sciences to help bridge the divide within our nation and the broader global society? Two, considering the intersections among realities, facts, and theories within the social sciences, as well as within urban and rural education studies, what are solution-based practices toward mending the effects of a fractured and polarized society? And three, how do urban and rural districts compare in terms of equity, sustaining educational issues, teaching staff, social mobility, and so forth? And then finally, in what ways may social science education promote theory and pedagogy to drive unity? Presenters today will share their work that contributes to this volume. Go ahead, Tracy. I'll turn it over to you. Oops, Tracy, you're muted. So we'll let you unmute and then tell us how it's going to work. Right.
Thank you, Laura. Hi, everyone. I'm Tracy Rock, and I'm just going to take a couple of minutes and kind of share with you the organization of the evening so you can kind of anticipate what we're getting ready to experience together. We were actually able to present this at the CUFA conference, the College University Faculty Assembly. And as a result of that, we found there was a great deal of interest in listening to and hearing from our authors and their topics and their research and what they're going to present and what they share about their chapters. But what we also found was there was a real interest in discussion. So we've tried to set this up tonight so that we do provide opportunities to really dig in with the authors in terms of getting to hear them present, but also leaving some time for discussion. So the way this is going to work is we are actually going to have 3 rounds of sessions, and there will be 2 choices within each of those rounds. And after each round, we will come back to the main room here. And then Laura, our great organizer, is then going to send us out to the next round of presenters for that small group discussion. After the 3rd round, we'll come back for an overall discussion and then some final updates from the SSEC board. So a couple of things you should know is that each round will be 15 minutes. we're going to have, the authors are going to have about 7 to 8 minutes to present. And then we'll have a facilitator in each room that will kind of help with the timing of it to then let know it's time to move into discussion around that author's work and their presentation. So those of you who responded to Laura's earlier email have already had the opportunity to fill out a Google form and tell us your interest and your choices for our sessions, our 3 rounds. And so she is going to be putting those groups together and sending us out into those groups. If you were not able to have the opportunity to fill out that Google form and make your choice of the selections, if you will, go to the chat. You will see that Laura is putting in a link to the Google form, and you can click on that and go ahead and make your choices for each of the sessions, which one of the authors you would like to be in that breakout room, and then she will be able to add you in there. So that's kind of how it's going to work, and we're looking forward to the author's presentations, but also your active engagement and your discussion with these authors as we move through these sessions. Laura, was I able to provide that fairly clearly, or is there anything I left out?
No, that works. I'm just looking at our pre-populated or pre-assigned rooms, and we have quite a few who are not assigned if we didn't sign in through Zoom with the email that that you gave me at first. So I do ask, it's probably going to take us a minute. We had tried the, I would love for anybody later to share with us if they have had success asking people to go to choose their room for Zoom. We have not had luck with ours. So what we will do is open rooms, and anyone who is unassigned, we'll put you into a room, and feel free to pop back out to the regular session, and then I can put you into the other one too. So it is just a little bit of coordinating to look at those Google forms and get you matched up with your name to add in, but we'll do the best we can. We're thrilled to have so many people join us.
And Danny, I'm going to keep time for about 7 minutes. You'll hear my my little buzzer to tell you you've got a minute left, and if you could wrap up after that. You can kind of give me a signal, just a thumbs up that you actually heard my buzzer, because in my classes sometimes they don't hear the buzzer. But give me a little thumbs up that you heard it, and then we'll move into discussion. So please, be ready to ask good questions, be ready to think about the themes of the book and any thoughts you have around questions, next steps, solutions, kind of practices that you're gaining or understanding about his work, and you want to pursue through the discussion in our small group. So Danny, I'm going to go ahead and start whenever you're ready.
Well, thank you very much, Tracy. I am very happy to be here. And for all those who do not know me, my name is Danny Yonto. I am an instructor of geography at Georgia Southern University. And tonight, what I really wanted to go over was this little book we have here and the chapter I've got inside of it. And the chapter is called Socioeconomic Disparities, a case study addressing the urban-rural divide using a World Cafe. So let's dive into what we got ourselves into tonight. So when we think about this American dream that we have, one of the questions that I want to ask all of you to keep in mind and to think about even right now is, do you believe that where a person starts in life shouldn't determine where they end up? Now, for me, that's a really important question, because that comes into this idea of where we start. We have this vision, and we can work as hard as we want, and eventually we'll get what we have in our mind. That is the essence of the American dream. But for some, the American dream in this country is a bit broken. And I was living in Charlotte, North Carolina for about 7 or 8 years. And what I found in North Carolina, especially in Charlotte, is that in the US South, it is a little bit more broken than anywhere else. So what's the map you're looking at right here? Well, what we're looking at is the chance of a child raised in the bottom fifth to go all the way to the top in this country. And when we think about the American dream, it's that economic mobility, that ability to be born in some kind of poverty, doesn't matter where you are, and your ability to get to the top. But what we're finding is that a lot of the places in the South, that's not necessarily true. And in Charlotte, the chance of getting to the top was 4.4%. Now, if we look at this in a different way, we can see that there are a lot of different factors that plague upward mobility in the United States. And when we look at it by race, we can start to see that the average income of poor white children from poor families, the distribution of where they end up is interesting, because it's basically mirrored to the average income of Black children from poor families. And what we're seeing here is that race does matter, and where you are starting out in this country doesn't necessarily mean you're going to make the money that you want. So the American dream for some is broken, and that's where I started to investigate in, okay, well, how can we fix it? And when we were talking about ways that we can think about it, when we talk about social mobility or trying to move up that ladder, that economic ladder, one of the things that we know is it's complicated. There's a lot of different factors that go into it. And one of the problems with all these factors at the local level is that when we go to local governments, a lot of the times we don't see them talking with one another. And so we have the affordable housing folks just focusing on affordable housing. We have the education folks just focusing on education, transportation just on transportation, public health just on public health. So what we wanted to do was find a way to get all these groups in one place at one time talking with each other. And so that was the basic objective of the chapter we had here. How can we build an interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary team? How can we work on some emerging community needs of social mobility? And how can we create opportunities for interactive conversations? And the way we went about doing this is something called the World Cafe. Now, the World Cafe is a very interesting, dynamic way to host a meeting, because it's completely different than just sitting in the audience and listening to somebody tell you what they think. So what the World Cafe does is it creates a context that's a very hospitable space for everybody. It makes everyone feel comfortable, and that way you can explore interesting questions that really matter to the community. And in this World Cafe, you encourage everyone to participate, and you connect different ideas. And then you really listen to see what everybody's trying to bring to the table. And then you share what you've all discovered. Now, how does this actually work? And this is where we come in to the actual table. And I really like this perspective of bringing everybody in and then taking that group, almost like what we're doing here, and breaking them up into different tables. Each table in a World Cafe usually has around 4 to 5 members in it. One person stays at that table, and usually you have 3 rounds. So that person is that team captain. He stays at the table, and you ask the question to the group. And everybody in that group contributes to their experience. They listen to what everybody else has to offer, but more importantly, they write things down on the table. They draw, they doodle, they write essays, anything that's comfortable for them to express their viewpoint. And then, after the time's up, those 3 people would go to a different table. The team captain stays, and 3 new members would come in. The team captain would explain what everybody talked about, and then everyone else would start trying to contribute their idea. So we build and we broaden the ideas, and after the 3 rounds, when you have multiple groups coming in and that team captain explaining what we've done, we can start to make those connections to see how we can dive deeper into what's going on, into those bigger questions. Now, for us, what was important was to have a vast different types of people entering our World Cafe. And what we had were groups from the education at the local government, we had health from the local government, transportation folks, and housing folks. So we had every type of representative in the local governments coming to our World Cafe in North Carolina talking about these issues. And the important thing was talking, Because what we found out was that in rural North Carolina, where we were looking at, there were some really big differences between the urban folks. And one of the things that we wanted to really dive into was, well, what are your priorities? And what we found was in the rural and the urban areas, different people had absolute different priorities. But it wasn't just transportation. We also saw that rural areas differed vastly in their health outcomes. And they also vastly differed in their education outcomes. Because younger people, when they are trying to figure out what's the best way to get educated, a lot of them are coming from families where they're suffering some kind of stressful environment. They have some kind of trauma. Well, what we found out in our World Cafe was if we focus in and zero in on those traumas, it does help those children get through those negative impacts, and it has more of a positive spin. So the World Cafe, we found, really did allow us to bring a group together and create opportunities for interactive conversation, reciprocal exchange, and diverse communication. It also allowed us to recognize differences in people's perspectives regarding how they really want to express their views and opinions. And just for some final thoughts, what I wanted to say is that what a World Cafe allowed us to do was really change the conversation, change who is in the conversation so that we can change the outcomes and really bridge this divide that we're seeing. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. You finished like with 10 seconds left. You are right on target. Must have practiced, right?
You give me 8 minutes, I'll take almost all of it.
That was fabulous. Thank you. So let's just start out with questions for our author, Danny, regarding what you heard and the work that he's doing with this. What I'm excited about is just an idea of pedagogy to get people to talk. That's I think the battle of bringing unity is actually getting people to talk. So this is exciting to hear how this works. Any questions?
I'm interested to know for what other issues you've used this World Cafe technique.
That's a really interesting question because you can ideally put it almost into any context. I've used it in the classroom setting to really get freshman students thinking. So it can work in the classroom setting. We've also used this at community meetings where we don't really have any kind of focused purpose on socioeconomic issues, but what we really care about at the community level is having some kind of conversation with the local people who may be too afraid to stand up and voice their opinion in front of maybe politicians or public officials. So it's a very useful tool to, like Tracy even said, just getting that conversation started, because you can doodle, you can write paragraphs, you can draw pictograms, anything you want. Try to express your viewpoint. That's the main goal. And we all know that people learn differently, but people also express differently too. So I really appreciate that question, Charles.
It looks like a way to enter into what would be viewed as a controversial issue, but you start with people's interests and needs and desires rather than starting from the other end where you can get very contentious very quickly.
I really like that too, yeah.
Yeah.
Kudos, Danny. I thought it was a fantastic idea. Thank you for the visuals. It's almost like Fishbowl, but it takes it so much further. I mean, it really caters to the learner. So I thought that was fantastic. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and one of the outcomes that we got from this World Cafe that we did was the people involved with it. They had this really fun idea was, can we create a mobile World Cafe where we can become the drivers of it and we can take that into the community? And so what you saw were people actively being involved in a process, learning in their firsthand experience, and then wanting to take that into their community. And one of the prime examples of this was one of my colleagues. She used this for her, she was in charge of her committee for another conference, and she just said, I can use this in that position as well. So you see the active learning and being able to take that and put it into different practices. And once you do it, it's a little contagious too. So I highly recommend giving it a shot if you're interested.
So I have a question. when these different opinions arose and different perspectives, obviously you were talking about a huge issue. So what was the action that came out of it? How were some of the how did the participants reconcile some of their differences when they're going from table to table, and then they're, you know, what's the conclusion, or where's the point where it moves forward?
So that is a really good question that when you dive into the chapter, you'll see there's something called a synthesis wall. And what happens is this is all done, if you're truly a World Cafe person, this is all done in silence. So what you do is you try to find ideas and you try to connect these ideas as well. And they can be through circles, and you can write down how they connect. And then we do have a moderator. So they're the ones who are kind of overseeing everybody. So in case something comes up where people want to try and, where they have a different of opinion, the moderator will come in and they'll try to say, okay, here's how we can try to put this aside, and maybe we'll come back to that later. But one of the things that's interesting is once you sort through the information and make the connections, you can start to see that there's a lot of overlap from different groups of people that they didn't see before. And after you do that synthesis, there's a little bit of a debrief. Okay, who has some ideas on how we can work on something that may be able to overlap? And this is where we have an interesting outcome from our research, where one of the individuals who was working on education and working on the idea of how do we quantify the amount of impact these students are having from their stress, we were able to connect her with some qualitative and quantitative researchers so that they could work on another grant program too. So I really like the connections that they were able to make from this so that they can move forward with their own work and use it to build and broaden their perspectives.
I think we're going to get a time limit warning that we're getting ready to be kicked back to the main session. So thank you for those questions. And at the end, we can, if you have further questions at the final discussion, we can bring these back to Danny. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. So we've got our second session, thanks to our presenting authors there, Wayne Journell and Danny Yanto. We appreciate you. We've got our second session set to begin, and again, we're going to have to troubleshoot a little bit of these logistics. We'll let Essie, our next group, come back in. Thanks again to Wayne and Danny for presenting. For the second session, these are our two options here. And I'm actually going to spit you back out into your groups, but if you want to switch into the next session, I'm gonna make sure we can finagle that and get you into the correct session. Okay, so bear with us again. I wish we had a little more Zoom expertise. That is not my forte, I will say. All right, so let's get us going here.
You're doing fine, Laura.
Doing great, Laura.
Hi, Laura.
This is the best group.
Better you
This is
than
why
me.
anybody who is not an SSEC member needs to, that'll be my plug right there.
Okay.
Sounds
All
good.
right, everybody. Again, I'm going to this session is already being recorded, so we're good. Actually,
Tracy, am I in the wrong room?
I might be in the wrong room. I think you're supposed to be, Dean is supposed to be in my room, but she may, it doesn't really matter. I can.
Well, I think Dr. Bohan and I need to be in the same room.
Yeah. Let me text Laura real quick.
Everybody is gonna be disappointed that they're gonna have to hear about a statue.
heard about this statue like 3 times now, and I still like hearing about it. So I don't think anybody will be disappointed.
Oh, Amy,
Absolutely not.
I signed up for your session too, Amy, for the 3rd time.
I actually just had some students featured in Atlanta Magazine for their part in taking down the statue in city of Decatur. So I'm very excited about this chat, and Dr. Rohan, of course. So.
Okay, Tracy, how can I move rooms?
I think Laura's going to have to do that.
Okay.
Part of the problem was we had hoped that everybody could choose their own rooms, but Zoom refused to let us do that for some reason. So she was trying to assign people. So, Dean, are you here?
Wade, I think maybe if you just leave this room, it'll take you back to the main room and she can reassign you.
Okay,
Yeah, I think
great.
that's true. Yep.
Thanks.
Yes, I'm here. Sorry, I was muted for a second.
That's okay. Awesome. And Jill, with you?
Yep, here I am.
We've got our presenters. Awesome. Perfect. Again, just as you experienced, we're going to try to keep this to 7 or 8 minutes. I'm going to be a little flexible with that, but I want to make sure we have time for people to ask questions and discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and start the timer and let you go ahead and get started. Thanks, Dean and Jill.
Thank you. Well, I'm Dr. Dean Vesperman.
And I'm Jill Lead-Otley, and I'm from Luther College.
And I'm from University of Wisconsin River Falls. And so this is our presentation on our chapter, Primary Contradictions, Qualitative Transformations of White Social Studies Teacher Identity.
So we use 2 different theoretical frameworks, and my background and experience is in critical whiteness studies. So that's one of the big frameworks that we use, in particular second wave teacher identity, which looks at whiteness in more complex ways. And Ryan Crowley's work with negotiated and transgressive white racial knowledge was especially germane. We found that to be a nice way to think about and theorize about what we were seeing.
And in my area of research is in cultural historical activity theory, because I'm very interested in how, when engaged in activity, students, individuals, pre-service teachers go through qualitative transformations, and then bringing in 2 primary aspects of that, which is multi-voicedness and primary contradictions.
So just quickly to save time, the course is a pretty typical, what we call the multicultural course in education, drawing on the works of the big names like Banks and Geneva Gay and Ledson Billings. And you can see some of the things that we did in terms of texts and documentaries and so forth.
So one of the key things that we did was there was Jill's class. So we took Jill's class and we mapped it out onto a 2nd generation mediational triangle. And what this allows us to do is to take a look at the activity in multiple parts and to see how these parts interact with each other. And so one of the key things we were looking at then was, how does the object of the activity, and you see the 3 main objects of Jill's class there, interact with the mediating artifacts to lead to multi-voicedness and primary contradictions. So I'm going to give you about 15 seconds, take a look at this, and then in the chat, if you want, type in there, is there anything that stands out to you, something that you see that's interesting? So I'll give you a couple more seconds, because we want to get to the really meat of our chapter.
Okay, want me to just go on, Dean?
Yes.
Okay, so basically we used qualitative and quantitative methods, so it was a mixed methods. For our purposes, we're really going to just focus on the qualitative data today, just to kind of focus in on things that may be more interesting, I suppose.
And we had only 2 participants in this study, primarily because they were the only 2 pre-service teachers who wanted to be social studies teachers. And so that's why our 2 participants are white males.
So basically, we'll just start with their initial conceptions of whiteness, how they thought about themselves, and I had them do an initial paper. So if you'll just take a minute and read Zach and then Isaiah's, and if you want, throw anything in the chat that stands out to you that you find particularly pops out in terms of themes.
All right. Is there anything in particular somebody wants to share that that stood out to them?
Ah, yeah, proud American, I see, Danny.
Mm-hmm.
Isaiah's kind of a really interesting one because he's kind of a classic story, right, of a student who comes in pretty conservative, and I think his identity is utterly American. He's not even thinking about how that is like sort of a clarion cry for like, I'm a white guy, that's what I'm thinking about being American. So he was kind of maybe an easier one to think about. Zach, on the other hand, he actually had as a one of the few students that has some experience actually in diverse settings, experiencing race and things like that. And so, but even given that, he really wanted to be colorblind in the sense that he's like, now I'm not going to judge, I'm not going to see skin or anything like that. So both of them very much colorblind discourse to begin the course.
So the other area then in their initial conception we looked at was how they conceptualize teaching. And we're going to do the same thing. So please read through Zach's and Isaiah's comments. And then in the chat, if you wish, what stands out to you? We'll give you a little bit more time. And so for us, when we were looking at Zach and Isaiah then, and what we noticed about was, of course, you know, they saw the issue of race and culture as something that could be an impediment to learning, impediment to their teaching, right? Something that would get in the way. So what we did then with their early initial work, right, is we laid out then their own mediational triangle, one for Zach, one for Isaiah. And then in here, you'll see we've highlighted a few things that we thought were prevalent in our research. So again, if you take about 30 seconds and look at the two mediational triangles and think about what stands out to you, what do you see when you look at these mediational triangles, right? Yeah, you're right, Charles. Isaiah doesn't see, yeah, you're right. He doesn't really worry about how they're going to use what they learn, right? Learning history is sufficient enough task, yes? So I'll give you about 10, 15 more seconds. Yep. Yes, Zach does have a broader worldview. You're right, right. The curriculum and children's experiences, the twain shall never meet.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
They're just supposed to teach history, apparently.
Oh, right, right. And why would history be connected to kids or kids' lives, right? Right? So then as they progress through the class and we go to the end of the class, we want to show you then their shifting conceptions.
So here again, some of the big themes, I think maybe for this one, Dean, I'll just talk through it. Does that sound good to save time? I think
sure.
I don't know how much time we have. So with Zach, you can see he literally self-proclaims his ideas about white privilege and racism have changed dramatically. And he attributes that partly to the class, but really to what's happening in the world. And this is the fall of 2017. So we have like Charlottesville riots and things like that. But it's interesting too, because even though he's acknowledging all these problems around race and racism, he's still kind of stuck in this, but I'm still pretty colorblind. And even though like I was really explicit about like, it's not a good strategy for teachers, right? I was contesting that, but he had this interesting thing where he wanted to be colorblind or like blind about culture. Well, excuse me, blind about race, but acknowledge culture. So he kind of wanted to embrace cultural competence, but he still kind of had this deep-seated idea that somehow it's not right to recognize and talk about race. And then, Isaiah was really interesting. He has more opportunity for growth, right? Because he was really sort of this utter American at the beginning, and he's willing to talk now about white privilege. And he even, if you had to, I made him categorize himself as a white man. So it was kind of interesting because he's still doing it like reluctantly, right? He's saying I'm white, but I'm kind of making him, right? For the context of the reflection paper. And he's also, he has this idea that the course taught him to do this. The course is telling him it's wrong to ignore race, but he doesn't take any kind of ownership of, recognizing his own sort of role in all this. He's sort of a white person, but in theory or intellectually maybe. So yeah, a lot more work, even though he's starting to be able to talk about race, he's still not seeing himself really, not in any way, as a white person.
And we see the same sort of qualitative transformation then in how they look at teaching. And what was interesting is that they began to see, especially for like, if you look at Zach here, race becomes something that becomes part of the class, but it's a pragmatic use of it, right? Like the term of we, right? We need variety. We need more of this, right? And then, the other thing about it is looking at, the quality of education is far more important than quantity. So now it's not just about history. It's not about just teaching about history. It's about making sure that children are having a valuable understanding of what they're learning, what they're doing. And then Isaiah, again, we see a qualitative transformation, maybe not as far as we would have hoped or liked, but he is changing his conceptions of how and why you teach, right? And now race isn't something that should be kept out of the classroom. Race needs to be brought into the classroom, again, depending on the situation and the student makeup. And then again, using their post reflections from the teaching tolerance survey and from their final reflections, we laid out then post conceptions mediational triangles. And again, we have just a little bit amount of time and we want to get to the implications. So I'm going to move to that.
You go with the first part, Dean, here.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
The beliefs, go for it.
So what we found is that just as was predicted in cultural historical activity theory, the voices embedded within the activity did lead to primary contradictions between the goals of the course and between the beliefs and values held by the participants. And those primary contradictions then led to qualitative transformations, as Engenstrom had argued is that when primary contradictions arise, subjects in an activity will try to resolve those contradictions, and that leads to qualitative transformations.
And then this last little piece here, this is where Crowley's work was really important. Mm-hmm. And you could see Zach already came in, right, with a more advanced, even though he was still colorblind, a more advanced racial literacy, if you will. And he also was able to talk about race in transgressive ways, as long as it was sort of intellectual and in our classroom. But once he started thinking about what that would mean for actual classroom practice, he was sort of backed off that, right? Like he could talk about race, but he couldn't really recognize the ways in which racism itself was kind of circulating perniciously in classrooms. And Isaiah, on the other hand, he also moved away a little bit from colorblindness, but was nowhere near being transgressive in his thinking. He wasn't thinking systemically or anything like that. But he did begin to sort of get into this negotiated racial knowledge by accepting white privilege as a theoretical construct, at least.
And so what this led us to then is that we have to help students move beyond from seeing race to seeing racism. Right?
You have one more minute.
Okay, go ahead, Jill. Sorry.
Sure. And then this was really interesting, just helping them really unpack race and culture, because I think part of the course, and this was a few years ago, I've sort of amped it up more in terms of being very specific about anti-racism, but part of the course really focused on cultural competence, culturally relevant, culturally responsive, culturally sustaining. And so I think students often felt like, okay, they got to be culturally competent, but the race piece, they could be a little more race blind if they're not going to be culture blind, right? So I really started to amp up the course in terms of being much more explicit about anti-racism. You got to be an anti-racist teacher, not just a culturally competent teacher.
Right. And it was really important because we talked about how these discourses needed to be in more education courses, not just in the multicultural education course. And of course, that led us talking about the importance of embracing the pedagogy of discomfort and strategic empathy in our courses to help guide our students as they reflect and think about.
Thank you, Dean and Jill. That was really interesting, and I know it's piqued everybody's interest to want to read further your chapter in the book. But let's see what questions people have, just for either some clarity or comments or discussion around this topic.
When I was listening, I was kind of caught that they were both history. Do you think that this would be any different if they were science, going to teach sciences, going to teach a different subject? Would that kind of impact how this would have worked out, you think?
To be honest, we have more data that we haven't gotten a chance to look at of people who are going to be different. We're going to teach different things. Primarily, the reason we picked these two is because of the fact is that these two young men were in Jill's multicultural education class, and then in the next semesters, they were going to be in my social studies methods courses.
Yeah, we thought it would be kind of interesting to follow through, like sort of see where they end up and see what percolates in Dean's classes, see if it makes a difference, right? Like, are they applying some of this theoretical knowledge? Are they challenging some of the systems and the things that we talk about in the, in the methods classes? We are excited to unpack well, for me in particular, the elementary teachers, just in general, because that's the group I focus on, because that's such an important role too, right? They're teaching history, and I think a lot of teachers, elementary teachers right now, are grappling with how do they talk about the Capitol riots, and they got to be willing to talk about race, because if they're not, then it's just different people with different ideas, right? And so, yeah, a lot of our work is just centered around trying to make them comfortable. Like, if you don't name it, you're complicit. And yeah.
I'm curious about kind of looking at from the maybe the opposite direction. If I were to observe a class, the teacher doing instruction, would I be able to tell the difference between the Isaiahs and the Zacks? And what would I be looking for? And I would imagine that from a novice teacher's perspective, it would be useful to look at sort of prototypes and to be able to be sensitive to, oh yeah, I see what you mean. This teacher did this, the other teacher kind of went in this direction. Are there such? Could it be useful?
Yeah. Well, I'll be honest, from a cultural historical activity theory, the key thing what I would be looking at is their mediating artifacts. That would be the first place I would look, right? Right. Because what are the tools? So what's the vocabulary they're using?
Right.
Right. What are the tools that they're using in instruction? What are the resources they're presenting to the students?
Yeah.
Right. Because that's going to then reveal, once you know the mediating artifacts of the activity. I mean, just if we're looking at a singular one-day classroom, then we might be able to start piecing out what is the purpose of the classroom. Because there's many times when you're working with a teacher, you ask what the purpose of an activity is, they'll tell you this, but then they start enacting the activity, and how they're using those tools and signs, those mediating artifacts, reveals that the activity really has a completely different purpose than what they're intending, right? And then, through that observation, you can use the pedagogy then to look at the rules of the classroom, the activity, and then look at how labor is divided and the types of communities they're trying to create. And I think looking at that bottom end of the mediational triangle, the community gives you a really big sense if they're colorblind, negotiated white racial knowledge, or if they're transgressive in their racial knowledge. Is thinking about that community that they're trying to create just in that activity.
Good.
Just noticed in the chat that Greg shared a resource with everybody if you want to take a look at that. And then Tanner has raised a question that you might want to see. We have about a minute and a half left.
Tanner, will you articulate it just out loud again? I read it, but.
Yeah, sure. So in their actual behavior and the way they were acting and their actual, so you know how you can understand a concept like academically and theoretically, but not integrate it into your personality and your worldview. So did their worldview shift, or from like an academic standpoint, were they starting to accept that race is an educational issue? Like, did you notice real, like, substantial human change, or was it academic theoretical change?
Probably more academic and theoretical, but yeah,
I'll be
unfortunately.
honest, with in the following semesters with Zach, there was more of his worldview was changing, right? He was really moving into that negotiated white racial knowledge when working with him. For Isaiah, it was very small, incremental little things, right? So yeah, but I mean, one of the things about qualitative transformations is, sometimes
All right. Now that we've got, I think, everybody back, we get to go through all that fun business one more time as we get ready for breakout session number 3. So in this session, we've got Amy Allen, who is going to be presenting, and we also have Jim Davis, who will be presenting his chapter on understanding United States economic inequality and the strain on our democracy. So let's send you back to those rooms, and then I will get you moving. Come on back as soon as you can. That's just the easiest way to get people in the right spots, and then I will transfer you over and get you in the right ones. Right.
You're gonna have about 7 to 8 minutes to present. And if you will, just give me the turn, next slide, please. I'll progress this through.
I will do that. Okay, it's Charlie White's fault that you're listening to and seeing this paper, because he wanted me to talk about the economy and democracy. That's why the title of Income and Wealth Inequality in the United States, the Strain on Democracy. And I can't think of a better topic when we're looking at the divide within, which was the theme of the conference, than economic inequality. Next slide. Economists use 2 tools to study wealth inequality. 1, personal income adjusted for inflation, which you read in the news is called real income. 2 is net worth analysis. Net worth equals assets minus liabilities, or what you own minus what you owe. Next slide, please. Real income affects those more significantly in lower income brackets than those in higher income brackets. The key point is the highest earning 20% of the United States households received more than half of the total income in 2018. There's your inequality data right there. Next slide, please. Here's a startling statistic on wealth inequality. An illustration of wealth inequality. This was in 2015. The top 20% of the population holds close to 3 times more wealth than the bottom 80% of the population. And the rich are likely to stay rich. Next slide, please. Wealth tends to grow at a rate of 6% per year. That's real estate, housing, stock market, bonds. That's the wealth. While income, which is the flow from business to worker, income grows less than 3% per year. In short, the wealthy are likely to stay wealthy. Next slide, please. Here are a couple of characteristics of the rich. The rich often have inherited wealth, and they guard it carefully. Many rich folks have political access, and believe me, they use it. Next slide, please. In the United States, it is estimated that as many as 100 million Americans may be considered in poverty. This is about 1/3 of our population. And I'll put my view on this one. To me, this is unacceptable. Next slide, please. Here are two implications of economic inequality related to our democracy. Research has shown that political bias tends to favor the wealthy. Poorer people vote much less than richer people, if they vote at all. Next slide, please. In the chapter, the written chapter, I have 7 proposals, but I've just put 2 right here. The first one is make the current federal income tax schedule much more progressive, add a wealth tax, and institute a negative income tax. And a negative income tax means that if you are at or below a certain level of poverty, then you receive income from either the federal or state governments. Second, institute a mandatory single-payer health reform for all citizens. In other words, a Medicare program for all. That concludes my presentation, and I'll leave you with a final question. What policy or policies would you recommend to correct economic inequality in the United States?
So you're teasing us with only telling 2 of your recommendations tonight, right?
I can give you more if I have. Do I have time?
Of course, but I like your question. Let's hear what others come up with and see if they are alignment with some of yours.
Well, I like Angel Ann's question about the minimum wage. I think that's a great issue, because the opposition to the minimum wage is that it's going to put stress on small businesses and the like. How does a guaranteed minimum wage fit into this issue of income inequality?
Well, I think that the fight, Charlie, over now, I think is the $15 an hour, right?
Right.
Well, that's barely a living wage. That's on the kind of the top. It's not in poverty, but awfully close. So that's how the minimum wage fits in. The minimum wage is never kept up with a sufficient standard of living. So that would be my response to it from the economics point of view.
It would be insufficient.
That's correct.
Other recommendations from the group?
Well, so question, if we consider like tax allocation by the government, an aspect of the economy, would reformatting that part of the tax law so it's less allocated towards military budget and more towards like where I think a lot of money needs to get focused is early and high school education, and then also reducing the cost of higher education. Would that help fix like poverty trends in America?
Well, I think anything that would support education, pre-college or college, would be of benefit. What I did also put in the paper is that we would have a law that says people must have 14 years of formal education. And you have to go to school until you get 14 years of formal education. Now that's pretty hard-nosed, and I know that education is controlled by the states. But otherwise, I don't think you're going to have a whole lot of people being really capable of assuming any decent work in the United States if you don't.
And that doesn't necessarily mean college. It would be
No,
it could
I'd be
in the
14
trades
years.
or
It could be. Yeah, it could be. Well, high school is 12, right?
right.
Okay. So it could be 2 years of community college, or it could be a trade. I think that concludes my session.
So I'm curious, what do you think about the, well, it started out as a bipartisan, I think, idea between Tim Scott and Cory Booker, but what do you think about the opportunity zones in terms of trying to incentivize private companies to invest in areas of deep poverty? Do you think that has any potential? I know the current problem with it is possibly a lot of conversation around it just needs to be regulated more. The way it currently is operating, there's some issues with it, tends to be just making the wealthy more wealthy. But I'm just curious about your perspective on the idea of these opportunity zones.
Well, I think you answered the question too. Is that it may well become self-serving, and then the other would be if I as a business owner have to provide for the education, it's going to be to my best advantage, and it's going to be to work in my company so that people know what they're doing. I'm not going to educate the entire public.
You know, Jim, this the question of who votes. That people in poverty tend to vote less frequently than the wealthy.
Yeah.
There's this whole theory of the rational voter. And you would expect that people who have more basis to complain and want change, they would tend to vote at higher rates.
Yeah.
But it doesn't work that way at all. So the question is then, if it's not, I mean, clearly the wealthy use the political system skillfully.
Yes.
What kind of incentives would make it more likely that those in the lower income levels would be more active? And of course, we saw a lot of activity in the last election cycle where grassroots organizing was absolutely crucial to get the vote out.
Yes.
That's a conundrum. I just don't know, what's the solution for that?
Okay. Well, in the chapter in the book, I recommended something like the Australian system of voting. Everybody has to show up to vote. If you're not, there's a pretty heavy duty fine that would be put on you if you don't. You don't have to vote, but I would say you have to vote. But I would recommend something like the Australian system that would mean that at least you have to show up, and that may do something and may not. But that's the best I could think about to get people to vote. I'm tired of saying, have you voted or please vote.
We will all be looking for that on the Twitter feed. Awesome.
Yeah. So when we began our book project several years ago, it seems like it's hard to manage the concept of time anymore. We positioned this by thinking about questions that we were struggling and grappling with ourselves, and Laura shared those from the beginning. And we used these and framed these in our call, and we also framed our understanding of the chapters and our organization of the book around these particular questions too. The divide within, and we thought a lot about the economic and the political, the social divide within our country and the growing gap between them. But we also considered the gaps between rural and urban communities. In that particular topic, there is a chapter that I have co-authored with Jessica Norwood and Paul Fitchett, where we actually look at those differences, particularly associated with educational experiences of students. But this divide and this separation has grown and even become this cavernous division that we cannot seem to surpass. We thought in doing our work and our research is that we have this collective body of research. We have collective knowledge and expertise that we bring together. But even in that work, we're often very siloed in our own discussions. We're siloed in the social studies, or we're siloed in political science, or we're siloed in economics. And rarely do we look across the social sciences and merge our thinking together. And that was the essence of how we were trying to work through these questions. We also looked into, and invited several, intentionally invited several scholars from urban education, because there are many topics that we were grappling with that we have a shared common interest. So I worked with a doctoral student, Ivana Hines, and we co-authored with Janine Jones an article where we looked at discipline disparities in this chapter, one of the chapters. And in that we identify through the discipline disparities based on racialization of disciplinary practices within schools and urban context. And we position that chapter and we document what's happening. But the closing chapter of our book, I think, really gets at the essence of where we find ourselves at this moment in time. And that chapter was by Betty Ray Butler. And Betty Ray looked at, discipline disparities, but not from an issue-oriented position, but from a solutions-oriented position. And in her chapter, she specifically states, the divide between data and solutions is long-standing in school discipline research. After decades of examining trends in data, enough attention has been devoted to identifying problems, but we need to shift and focus on what those solutions are. And she describes in her work that it's not a map, but a compass, a direction, a trajectory for change. We have good research that we can draw upon, but we need to situate our work in the context of solutions. So in our last remaining minutes, we would like to give an opportunity for you to offer some general thoughts, and we welcome you to unmute for as much time as we have, to what are our solutions? We find ourselves now at a real critical juncture in our nation's history and our nation's identity. But what are the solutions and the directions, and how can we move forward in grappling with this divide, to bridge this divide, to build a more united understanding, especially among our scholarly endeavors? And also, I would argue, is reaching out beyond the scope of the communities in which we normally share our work, to try to expand those ideas, to bring this discourse, this conversation, and our understanding to everyone who has a vested interest in education, a vested interest in democracy more holistically. Because I think the more communication, the more conversations, the better understanding that we can have together. So I will welcome any general thoughts, takeaways from your session, any comments that you might have.
Tina, do you want people to put it in the chat?
Oh, no, go ahead and talk. That's fine.
I was just going to call out one of the presenters that I was able to facilitate with, and I see he just unmuted, so he's probably going to talk. But I was just going to point your comments, Tina, about trying to generate solutions across disciplines, across all these divides. And Danny was able to share in his chapter, Danny Yonto, and in our session tonight, just how important those conversations are. And he presents, about this notion of a world cafe, but it's really a process, a structure of how to engage in these kinds of conversations that really pull out people's ideas and strengths from a variety of perspectives and ways to engage people and move people around across different groups. And so I would just point to that in terms of, I think we need the space, but I think we need structures and processes that help us do this work. And so Danny, if you want to add to that, I kind of called you out, but I thought it was relevant to Tina's comments. So.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we talked about in the breakout room was that it's hard sometimes to get the ball moving and to start asking questions, because sometimes we don't know how to articulate the questions. So we need to find different ways to bring ideas and brainstorm together in a space where you don't feel like you're gonna be pushed away for saying the wrong words or you didn't articulate the question right. It's okay to do that, because one of the struggles that I've had with interdisciplinary research is that it's really difficult. It's difficult to get everybody on the same page, but that shouldn't stop the process. So one of the things that I'm wondering is, when we talk about the urban and rural, I've had the privilege to live in a rural area now for 2 years. And one of the things that I found is that because we're so far apart, even in the rural areas, it's really hard to have that communication. So I wonder if how do we get people together in a time when we can't get together? And what are some other ways that we can get people talking and communicating? Anybody out there that is interested in trying to find ways to do that, please reach out. I'm happy to find solutions to get people moving, because once we do start that moving, then we can coalesce around certain questions to try to make meaningful solutions.
To follow up with what you said, Danny, one of the doctoral students at Georgia State, Angel Ann Stevens, says the problem is that we in public schools are not having these conversations. So how do we get the conversations to happen in public schools?
In so many ways, I think, Karen, just to continue the conversation of, obviously teachers have to feel like they have the space for that. So that's going to come from leadership, and leadership needs to make sure they understand the guidance that they can provide for teachers. And I think it even encompasses thinking about our school composition and thinking about the audiences and the populations that attend our schools, and if those are going to be authentic conversations that also reflect broad perspectives, is something to consider too, with the way that that schools are often segregated right now too. So that's just another piece to consider.
There's been a lot of talk recently about the deficit in civic education in the United States, and there's sort of this view that, gee, a lot of the bad stuff that's been happening really wouldn't have happened if we'd done a better job in schools and civic education. But part of the problem with that, I think, is that we think of schools as the place where you can inoculate a society. If there's a problem in society, give it to the school, they'll take care of it. And I think in the area of civic education and in a nation divided more thoroughly, nothing's going to happen in society until schools can't be an isolated oasis in the community. Schools have to engage with the community. Otherwise, there are going to be a lot of places, a lot of schools that won't even touch the stuff that we've talked about tonight because they can't, because they're creatures of the community and they're just prohibited from doing that. I think a lot more, I mean, that one thing I liked about Danny's session about the World Cafe is that might be a context in which schools and the community can converse together, and they can see the school's activity as part of a larger community effort to bring people together.
And once the conversation starts too, which is interesting, and not just in a World Cafe, but usually in general, that's a snowball effect. And I like the fact that even in this share out session, we're trying to think of next steps, because how do we continue the conversation? Because we might think of things later tonight, and that feedback loop is really important for that motivation and momentum too.
I wonder also, as far as like having conversations and, you know, there's a lot of negative sides to COVID, but one of the positives is that the way that we, you know, all have the ability now to meet in this virtual space, and it's becoming more accepted and more the norm. And so it's almost like one of the things that Dean and I have talked about is like, how do we keep the best of what was forced to change because of COVID as we move forward to try to think about what's the new normal post-COVID. And I think having access to these virtual spaces may be one of those things. And so thinking about how we can continue to facilitate conversations like this, and like in Danny's presentation, across different career fields, across different stakeholders that all matter in these conversations. How can we facilitate more of those conversations virtually? Because it's easier to do it this way, and we can include more people that we wouldn't maybe always think to have in that conversation. And it's easy to do that now.
So Robert, right in the text chat, this is an intensely personal moment in the American psyche. The rest of the world watches while you struggle with important issues of democracy and freedom. The same questions will reverberate around the globe as the world moves toward a more authoritarian version of governance. Education remains the key to democracy, equity, and greater social justice. Now, I think it does, but I also think we have to understand the roles that schools play. You know, I think the pandemic itself has really revealed the inequalities that exist in society, but it's also recognized for, I think, at least in our community, it's raised the role that schools play. They feed students. They are the ones that are providing the socio-emotional support for students. They're the safe space to get away from other abuses or whatever their experiences students might have. There's so many more attributes of schooling than just content learning. And I think reframing what education means, what education is, in the context of the well-being and the development of not only the mindset and understanding of our civic institutions and our role as citizens, but we also have to really look to the holistic understanding of who we are as individuals. And I think the school is a real critical piece of that. But Wayne made a real key point, and I think this built off of what Laura said too, is, you know, if we aren't having conversations with the leaders in our schools, and they aren't having conversations with the community, the divide and a clear disconnect is pervasive between those different entities, because they don't have a common shared interest, because they have different aims or motives they're promoting. I think from Wayne's talk in particular is really grappling and looking at and becoming more critical as a society of recognizing the motives and the interests that drive the what's happening and what's changing. So we have a few, Laura, if you want, we have just a few final updates and remarks that I think Charlie and Greg are going to share with you. I would strongly encourage you to look at the broad scope of work of this book. We have been honored to work with some amazing authors in the editing and the development of these chapters, but I think, if anything, it was fortuitous in much of the writing, and I think Kara really captured this when she said she and Wade embarked on their writing before this happened. And when I reflect on, you know, where we were when we were sitting in the room brainstorming, trying to figure out what we wanted to do with this particular book with the SSEC conference, never would I have ever considered where we are now. But it seems like it was just the pertinent and most important conversation that is a through line for us and a really critical direction for us to consider in our future work too. So Charlie and Greg, thank you very much from SSEC for sponsoring this webinar, for sponsoring the support behind the book and the conference in 2019. And we are very grateful to have had the opportunity to lead in this work. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the work that you all have done. It was beautiful. Round of applause. Thank you. Charlie, if you don't mind, I'll just step out real quick. I'm shorter and I just kind of want to make it quick and clean, and you can just take the rest of the time. Deference to you. Thank you, Charlie. And thank you all the other people on the call that sort of paved the way before I got to this organization or arrived in the field of social studies. And I especially want to thank Laura, Tina, and Tracy. I want you all to stay tuned for our next volume. Amy Samuels and I were also going to be series editors and volume editors, which makes us equally or even more grateful for the creativity that the authors put forth, because we're able to see you all's wonderful work. But that comes out this summer. It's called Fostering Diversity and Inclusion in the Social Studies. I think you all will enjoy that. That'll be out well into the summer. And then we're going to have another conference this summer. And I think we're going to continue alternating with international and domestic travel once we're over this pandemic. So if some of you are thinking about membership or just jumping in on some of your updating some of your travel locations, definitely consider joining. And so, as I said, more than anything, thank you all for your participation. And for those of you who were here before we actually got here, you all paved the way, and I want you all to continue doing your thing. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Greg. And let me reiterate my thanks to members of the board, Laura, Sarah, and Dean, who have been working on these, the first of what will be a regular web presence. And the content of these is going to depend a lot on the interests of members and what members want to share with each other. So I want to reinforce the idea that we would love to invite folks to become members of SSEC. If you're a doc student, there's a student membership level for you guys. And there are lots of opportunities to do some neat stuff within the organization. Yes, there will be a conference, a virtual conference this summer. We've just posted the call for proposals on the website. So you can find out information about membership, about the call for proposals, and other books in the SSEC book series. Just go to ssec-inc.org. There's the pitch. And you can find us on Facebook and Twitter as well. So thank you all very much for coming and for joining us for the evening. This will be posted on the website as well, so others can see it. And we hope to see you again soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Great evening.
Later.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great job.
Thanks everybody for making time to join.